Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's window company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Greenberg Traurig, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Briarwood Organization, Beechwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Friedman, LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates, Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Markham LLP, Marcus and Millichap, Margolin Weiner and Evans LLP, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, the Moynihan Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, the Wickoff Group.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller. So we're in the spring of 2010. Allegedly, we're out of the recession. Allegedly, the world is getting better in the office market, but I'm not certain. And I'm not certain because my four guests today have mixed views on the state of the market. So I'd like them to express their opinions on the state of the market. My guests include, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Mark Boissy from Cassidy Turley.
Chairman
of the New York region.
Okay. Matt Van Buren, Executive Managing Director at C.B. Richard Ellis. Mark Weiss, Vice Chairman at Newmark Knight Frank. And last but not least, my friend Joe Harbert, the COO of the New York region of Cushman and Wakefield. So Joe, you've been on the show a number of times. So how do you look at the spring of 2010 in the office market? I want the truth. As they would say, in the trade, I want the emis. I really want to know what the truth is.
The truth is there's uncertainty in the marketplace. We had a big uptick in activity in the fourth quarter, and January and February have been slow. They're very active compared to last year.
But last year was a depression.
Well, we're up 61% in leasing. We've had a number of months where there's been no sublet space put back on the marketplace. And leasing activity for February is average. It's the average of the last 7 Februaries.
Yeah, but how do we look at the future, Mr. Weiss?
A lot of people within our industry are looking at the future with rose-colored glasses. And I think Joe just touched on that there's been a lot of leasing activity. A lot of transactions have happened. But people are only looking at the transactions like a cheerleader in many instances, in that a company rents some office space. It hits everybody's statistics. All the major firms seem to have outsourced their statistical tabulation to CoStar. So CoStar shows a lease of 100,000 square feet of space is absorption. What they're neglecting to look at is when the back end of that transaction, after the move takes place and the space hits the market, that it's oftentimes negative absorption. And beyond that, they're looking at this 100,000 square feet of space in terms of the criminally branded 27% revenue loss factor, whereas the space they're leaving behind has perhaps a 22% loss factor. So we're in a time where there was a pause or paralysis, lots of leasing, but behind that is going to be a flood of space, some real, some imaginary, that's going to diminish the feeling of optimism in the market.
But isn't it also true that many of the tenants who are taking space are taking less space than they had previously? They laid off employees, they've cut down a little bit? I mean,
Tenants are trying to be efficient with the way they utilize their space these days, that's for sure. So most of the transactions that you're seeing right now A lot of them are renewals where tenants are taking a little bit less than they formerly occupied. If they're relocating, they're using, as Mark said, they're trying to find space that's more efficient for them. Working on, is this the right loss factor for me? Checking out making sure that the floor plate is the right kind of floor plate for their business. So what we're seeing is that tenants are taking less space.
Now, what about rents? How much concession, if I'm a tenant, can I still get, a month a year?
Easily.
Can I get
more?
So if I'm a tenant and I'm a good tenant, I can get at least a month a year, is what you're saying. And what about tenant improvements? Because I think prior to the show, we were talking about Park Avenue, sublease space that you've been involved with, and other ones.
Right.
I mean, what are you paying for
TI packages? TI packages are in the $50 to $75 a foot range, depending upon the nature of the landlord, depending upon whether it's a direct lease or a sublease. But definitely somewhere in the range of $50 to $75 is doable.
Now,
I mean, I don't know. Would you disagree with me, Mark?
No, I agree completely.
I'm not certain who, when we were talking before in the green room, said that you can get space in Park Avenue, 277 Park Avenue, or the Mutual of America building for $50 a foot.
I said that to you. And keep in mind, those are sublease spaces that are put on the market by a major financial institution who has decided to retrench. Okay.
But they're sublease spaces for 10 or 11 years. We're
Those
not
are
talking about a
long-term.
2-year sublease today.
Those are long-term
Those are great subleases.
They are.
I think what we've seen also over the last 9 months is strong velocity in the market relative to the paralysis that we saw, but not that far off the 60-month average, which included the best years of the boom period, 06, 07. So there has been real velocity in the market. I would say, as it relates to the type of space that went, capital preservation on both sides of the equation, landlords and tenants, was paramount. Yeah. Everyone was conserving their capital. There was a tremendous amount of space that was released onto the market. Negative absorption during the downturn from start to present has driven availability up over 14% in all of Manhattan, 15%, something like 15% in Midtown. What you saw is a tremendous amount of that built space, and particularly on the sublet side, has now leased. And so what you're left with is less desirable sublease space and direct space. And I think what we're all saying, to connect to what Joe started the conversation saying, is that we're uncertain about where real economic growth is going to come from. When what is going to drive the reduction in our over 10% unemployment rate in New York. And so leases expire, deals will be done, there'll be velocity in the market. But where is the growth going to come from is the question.
And what about, all of you have an involvement not only in Manhattan, in the other markets. What happens when a depository trust moves to Jersey City and we lose space because there are great incentives? There are great incentives in New Jersey versus New York City. And what happens even in the White Plains market when a company like Starwood moves up to Connecticut with all this? That's going to have an effect.
Well, the downtown market right now is relatively strong, comparatively speaking, and you're probably looking at somewhere around an 8%. I don't know, Joe, you're thinking about right on that? 8%
8 to
vacancy,
9%, yeah.
8 to 10%.
But it's going up. We think it's going up.
It's definitely going to go up.
We have
with Goldman Sachs, moving into the new headquarters, leaving space behind, that's not exactly absorption. That's a negative absorption. With AIG's issues, and you've got other vacancies that are looming. Will Merrill Lynch decide to stay downtown?
And as we were saying before, Deloitte's a very big question, especially with hoteling of space.
Oppenheimer funds. You've got a list of a half a dozen to a dozen firms that are in the mode of deciding whether they want to stay downtown.
But there is a lot of activity. There's a lot of activity amongst tenants over 100,000 square feet and above. And just this year, you have 6 deals in the first couple of months of the year. 4 of them are new leases. Only 2 are renewals. It's kind of a reversal of the trend of last year.
And
that's
four,
about capital preservation is
there'll be
critical.
19 million feet of renewals this year. That's a lot of leasing volume. So I'm hoping you're right, and that there's another 10 million or so of re-leasing.
Mark, your thoughts?
I'm still stuck on that. Everyone's defining the marketplace in terms of square footage, and the landlords have over-leveraged themselves. So there's a segment of the market where you just can't do business. That tenants have responded to the markup on space by really innovating their way to using a lot less of it. And it's now a cultural thing, like it is in Europe, to use much less office space. And as a case in point, we've represented the French publisher, Hachette Philippaki Magazine Group. And we rented 122,000 square feet of space for them. It was a sublease from Time Inc. So that was a sign of life, another first quarter 100,000 square foot deal.
It's a nice lease.
Very nice lease.
But they're leaving behind 277,000 rentable square feet per their lease. But when now that space hits the market and the landlord where they're leaving bumps that up to a market loss factor, it's 295,000 square feet of space. So I'm very fearful, Michael, that the other shoe hasn't dropped. And I think that's going to have an enormously suppressing impact on rents.
It's interesting. Carl Weisbrod's been on the show a couple of times, and I was downtown. I'm at 1010 Winds on the weekend, and they're at 345 Hudson.
Right.
And the building, major renovations and everything took a long time, and everybody was moving that to Hudson Square a couple of years ago. There's so much space leased in Hudson Square, and then I went up to Carl's office and I said, "What's happening?" He says, "I'm not getting my $45 a square foot anymore. I'm not getting, I'm giving away space at and they don't have any mortgages. I mean, the church had no problem, but, there's some problems over there in the Hudson Square market, and people like being in Tribeca."
I think though that little sub-market of those Hudson Square, Tribeca, Chelsea markets, 111.
I think the Chelsea market's a different
but
market.
There's a subset of cool buildings where people have innovative workplaces that typically attract tenants who are not financial services tenants that have held their value better than anything else in the marketplace.
But that's $40 a square foot. I mean, Hudson Square is not the meat market. I think the meat market spaces, the Chelsea market is probably much higher, right?
I think
It's more expensive to rent space in a building like that than it is at Park and 51st Street.
yeah.
It's just hard to imagine.
I mean, where are you involved these days in space? The majority of the space that you're
Well, I
renting?
mean, we're Midtown. We're all probably is our biggest focus. It's the largest market, the largest of the three sub-markets in Manhattan. I would say I have a couple reactions to Mark's comments. I mean, one is that you really have to stratify the landlords. It's very misleading to generalize about all landlords. We've done an analysis that shows something in the order of magnitude of 40 to 45% of the square footage in Midtown Manhattan, as an example, is controlled by 10 major landlords. And we've done an analysis of the role in those buildings and the current rents that they're getting. And with one exception, all of those landlords are on extremely strong financial footing. So there's half the market where you have your landlord on extremely strong financial footing. Then there was, as Mark referred to, the speculative landlords that are having a much more difficult time right now. And you can see that in the capital markets and what's happening presently, though not a lot is yet trading. There's a lot of distress in that market. So one of the things we have seen is that tenants are beginning to ask very specific questions around the debt stack on a building, around the capital health of the building, around the ownership structure of the building, around cross-collateralization of the asset. And so
hasn't the worm turned these days?
It truly has. I mean, those were the questions, actually.
Landlords will always after the
What's a
tenant.
credit tenant?
Yeah, what kind of credit is my tenant going to bring
That's
to the
right.
table? And now it's just the opposite.
That's right. It's actually a street that now runs both ways. I say all that to say that back to my point about economic growth. Without real economic growth, without real employment growth returning to the economy, I do think that it's a game of movement of existing businesses. And if you look, at the base of our economy, it's financial services, it's other professional services, legal
I mean,
law
last
firms.
year, the 5 or 6 of the major leases were law firms in 2009.
Yes, that's
They're
right.
still
And
very-
that's not an
gonna
atypical.
continue.
Those were the major leases over there, with the exception of the Gap, at 40 Worth Street. This was the market. Law firms are still there, but they're retrenching also. fees aren't there. You know, there's a different market today on that.
I mean, healthcare obviously is strong.
There have been some big healthcare
Education,
deals.
not-for-profit. You're going to be
Education,
seeing
medicine
those.
school. I
You're
mean,
going to be
it's-
seeing a lot of those
Yes.
deals a
And
little
you're
more.
seeing two
and you've got to
media
be very
firms now.
creative about it.
Correct.
Which,
You had Horizon Media, and you have Hachette Philippachi, so there's a little bit of life in that market as well.
you know, everybody, you know, I think the big topic, and we briefly broached it, was Lower Manhattan. What do you see truly happening in Lower Manhattan for the B buildings and, you know, the other buildings? I mean, you know, I consider Battery Park City a different type of market. You know, those are the newer buildings that were built in the late 80s and 90s. It's a different world. What about, you know, the buildings at 26 Broadway, you know, the buildings on Broad Street and all that? Where do you see that?
They've seen
You know,
some
but-
slippage in rent. We're seeing deals down in many of those buildings in the upper 20s now. So we've broken 30 again on a lot of that space. But it's actually pretty active. And, you know, we're thinking that the top of the downtown market still is in the 40s. We're seeing some activity in high-quality buildings. Actually, downtown held up pretty well last year, as Matt said.
It did.
The question is, what's going to happen when all the space hits the market in the future? And, you know, we think the vacancy rate's going to go up.
Now, the interesting thing that we discussed prior to the show was the Bronx office market. What were you saying, Mark?
It's we have two requirements for Manhattan-based clients for space up in the Bronx, and you know it is truly a supply-constrained market, and prices are really full, remarkably full, for space in a kind of a beat-up building. As long as it's near 138th Street, it's trading at $45 a foot, which.
And you get REIT benefits.
Right,
If
and you
it's-
get the REIT
And you
benefits.
get a $12 REIT benefit, which really cuts the rent down.
It's
They had $5 or $10 a foot, and you can be on Park Avenue.
Well, I was,
That's
I think,
right.
but I think that is the point, honestly, that the outer boroughs, as well as the other ancillary markets around Manhattan, are attractive generally in proportion to the size of the gap between midtown and downtown rents in those markets. So the Bronx is an interesting.
I think the Bronx, that's just an interesting characteristic because there's such a limited number of office space. Now, I don't believe that is the same case in downtown Brooklyn, because I believe downtown Brooklyn with Metro Tech, I think you can get space because JP Morgan has the
Morgan, they've been
availability
looking
of
to
it,
sublease
you know,
space,
on sublease space for $20 a foot. Now, I haven't done a show recently on Long Island City, but you know, is the MetLife space still available in Long Island City?
I don't know.
I believe it is.
No, and that's a large amount of space in Long Island City, probably in the low 30s or the high 20s, with REIT benefits over there.
Sure.
Now, what about the, you know, we brought it up before. What about the White Plains market? Any?
We saw a lot of leasing. We represent a property up there. We had a lot of leasing last year. We were pretty successful, but it's an interesting market because of its history with large corporate users. So when that market gets soft, it gets very soft for a long time.
Now, you encompass New Jersey. I had Mitch Hirsch on a panel and on a show, and Mitch is still complaining about the state of New Jersey. Now, I had Emmanuel Stern on the show, and he says, you know, he had all these ads about, you know, I'm only 7 minutes away, you know, you have these great benefits and all that. How do you guys see Jersey, especially with the depository trust deal, which was basically $49 million in incentives over there, you know, if you look at it that way?
I see a couple things. I mean, one is that all the suburban New York markets have traded in a much narrower range than the Manhattan market in particular, where we talk about net effective rents at 40% off the peak of the 06, 07 ending in 08 run-up. In New Jersey, as an example, they traded in a much narrower band, under 10%. So the reality is there, I think you're looking at more of an availability and velocity game as opposed to a pricing game. In Manhattan, it's been a much farther fall on the pricing front. And I would say that applies in general to the other suburban markets as well, Westchester and Connecticut, Stamford market as well.
Well, you know, my experience with New Jersey, and you know, every time there's a major corporate move within Manhattan, you have to consider alternatives outside of Manhattan. Nobody wants to leave, but people have to be financially responsible. So one of the nice things about this dramatic fall off in volume and rent and all that stuff is that Manhattan has become much more affordable. And as it's more affordable, companies have the ability to hire good people. And with those good people, they can grow their businesses. So this is almost a self-policing development. Lower the price, companies can flourish. Companies can flourish, companies can grow. So some of this growth is going to happen because of the dynamic, unique nature of New York and the type of people that are always attracted to New York. We're our own worst enemies by pricing up the market and driving our human capital, our intellectual capital, away from New York.
When I started this show in 2001, it was right after 9/11, when everybody felt the world was over and office rents were down to the lower levels. You know, it was a difficult time. Do we see this? Do we see $100 rents coming back soon?
They're already back.
No,
They're back.
With the exception of
Five buildings maybe
we're
in
talking
Manhattan
about.
where you're talking, you could
Do
might
we
do
see
that.
$100 rents? Do we see on 6th Avenue $80, $90 rents? You know,
Not in the
No,
foreseeable
not yet.
future.
Not yet.
I mean, when you look at, real estate obviously is a laggard in the economy, and if you look back over the last few recessions, I think you'll see that about 6 quarters roughly after a recession is over is when you begin to really see some rent growth. Well, if you assume that the recession ended in December of last year, we're talking about at least into 2011, maybe the end of 2011, before you see a little bit of rent growth. And that's assuming we get the employment that you were talking about, Matt. And, who knows? Who knows whether we get that?
Well, we think net effective rents have really hit the bottom. We think they hit the
As
bottom
do
at the
we.
end of the third quarter last
so
year.
you think
and they're
net-
starting to creep back up.
So you believe we've reached the bottom?
Yes.
I don't think you believe that.
No, I believe rents are going to go up, but for not the same reason that you believe rents are going to go up. We came out of this recession quickly, given how deep it was and how scary it was, through a massive infusion of debt. That debt hasn't gone anywhere yet, and the only way to make that go away is to let inflation work its magic. And unfortunately, inflation is going to run its way through rents too. So rents are going to go up for the wrong reasons because everything in our society is going to go up.
Although, New York, suffered 125,000 job losses last year. They had predicted something close to that for this year, but I think you're going to see some job growth this year, and I think that's going to stabilize rents. I really do.
The projections are that job loss is going to total about 200,000. At the worst days of the crisis, people were saying it was 320,000.
Right.
And only 120 or 130,000 of those are going to be office-using jobs.
Right, and if you look
So
back
that's
at the
why I
last
think we've
two
hit bottom.
recessions, Mark, you'll see that there were far more jobs lost. So we are going to recover, hopefully, a little bit quicker than the last couple of recessions. That's the hope.
Now, how do we, if I'm a tenant, I mean, all of you you used to be on the other side of the coin. You were on the dark side. When you were at Studley, you represented the tenants as opposed to the landlords.
No, I still
He
don't.
still does.
I don't
He's
represent any
unbelievable
landlords.
at it.
Oh,
He's a
so
tenant
you're
rep
on,
guy.
you're on the dark side.
I'm a tenant advocate.
Oh, you're a tenant advocate.
Period.
So you're the tenant advocate over here. So as a tenant, what kind of deals can I get from landlords today? I'm not talking about rents. I'm talking about type of concessions. Work letters. What's out there? I'm a 30,000 square foot. I'm not a 100,000 square foot.
All right.
Okay, I'm a 30,000 square foot tenant. I want to go into Midtown. Tell me my best deal. I'm not asking the building. I want to know the best deal I could get.
You could structure a rent in a pretty good building starting at $45 a foot, and you can get a perfectly good, nice installation built for you with absolutely no risk or cost, and still get 6 or 8 months of free rent on top of that. So in answer to what Mark spoke about before, a landlord, to get $1 will have to spend $4. Now he'll get that $1 a year for 15 years. But to spend 4 years worth of rent to get a tenant shows a pretty compelling market. And that's where we are right now.
So the tenant is king. It's not the, as we would say, landlord.
Well, with 13-14%, vacancy, equilibrium isn't until you get to about 9%. So tenants right now,
It's still a tenant's market.
Yes.
tenants are king.
That's right.
And what about the Plaza District? Buildings like the GM building, 9 West,
Some of those are anomalies because
yes.
you can get, when you get up into the tower of those properties, you can command triple digits.
I'm not talking the tower.
Oh,
I'm
okay,
talking
what are you
about
talking?
I'm talking about being in on 57th Street where people wanted to be,
Right,
Fifth
but not-
Avenue over there.
I would say for several reasons. One, their iconic status,
Right.
and two, the nature of the tenants that occupy those buildings and the relative, portion of their cost structure that rent represents.
Now-
So they're less price sensitive, and those are still supply constrained properties.
Quick question. If you're a strong REIT like Brookfield, Vornado, SL Green, you can afford not to be that. You can wait on the market. They don't have to. It's not a
On
tenant.
the other hand, those are the folks that are making deals. They're when you get to bring a tenant to one of those properties, they make deals.
They're
They're
not-
deal
but
makers.
It's remarkable. They have the ability to be patient, and
That's
they're
right.
and they're leading.
Am
the
I
market.
right? They have the ability. They raised all this capital last year. They have all the money. But they're willing to make the deals.
Yes, not only the REITs, also the strongest families. I mean,
Oh,
they,
absolutely.
they manage their assets for the long term. They don't try to take the last nickel off the table, and as a result, they're in strong financial position despite the economic downturn.
So, in summation, I'd say that it looks like the world is maybe getting better, even though Mr. Weiss is the pessimist. Normally, I'm the pessimist. They call me Dr. Doom and Gloom. And the spring may be pretty good for the office market, right?
I think May, June, July is going to be good. We're still in winter, Michael.
Okay, I'd like to thank Matt, Mark, and Joe. See you next week.
Major funding for this program is made possible by grants from Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and Perfect Building Maintenance, Kilroy Architectural Windows, Inc., New York's Window Company, New York Community Bank, Capital One Bank, Greenberg Traurig, LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Briarwood Organization, Beechwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Friedman, LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Jack Jaffa and Associates, Real Estate Consultants, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Madison Realty Capital, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Markham LLP, Marcus and Millichap, Margolin Weiner and Evans LLP, M&T Bank, Meridian Capital Group, the Moynihan Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Orphanides and Associates, SJP Properties, Sterling and Sterling, Stonehenge Partners, Urban American, the Wickoff Group.